Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. This week on the show, we are taking a look at the biggest moments of 2023 and talking about what lies ahead this year. Yesterday, we highlighted the narratives that dominated Indian politics, and in the coming days, we will explore international relations, science, and technology. But today, we are talking about what changed for the Indian economy in 2023 and the factors that will influence it this year. And for this, we are joined by Indian Express's Udit Misra. So, Udit, this time around last year when we were talking, inflation, price rise, was one of India's biggest concerns. For example, in April 2022, inflation was 7.8%. And while later on it did come down, this was something that did persist quite a bit. Before we talk about anything else, could you tell us if we were able to get past that this year?
Yes, so it is true that we have made an improvement on inflation. To a great extent, it had to do with the fact that even last year, by the time we were finishing the year, the headline numbers had started moderating. Although the core inflation, which is the inflation which has seeped through in other prices, not just fuel and food, had remained high. And since the central bank had raised interest rates, that effect took its course, and we saw that there was a moderation in the inflation rate. I would not go ahead to the extent of saying that we've totally controlled inflation. There are some concerns still, and inflation hasn't come back to the 4%, which is the target rate that RBI has. But it is true that on several months, it has come within the RBI's comfort zone, which is between 2% and 6%. So to that extent, we have seen a moderation, and there are now growing murmurs that perhaps in 2024, we might actually see an interest rate cut because of the fact that inflation has moderated. And somewhere later on in 2024, we hope to hit the 4% mark in inflation rate.
Right, for a healthy economy and a growing economy, 4% is what the RBI aims for. That's what we want inflation to be.
Yes, typically it can be counterintuitive to say, why should an economy have inflation if we can actually control it? But actually a certain amount of inflation is good because it sort of incentivizes everybody to produce because there are gains to be made. And 4% is considered to be that ideal level which would benefit India. Anything higher than that typically drags consumption. Anything lower prohibits or disincentivizes production.
Yeah, and it's not just inflation, right? There are actually a bunch of metrics that we were really struggling with as an economy and which we managed to take care of this year. In fact, in some sense, we have managed to score a hat trick. Talk about what these metrics are and when did we start seeing this change?
So I think, the first thing that we must talk about is the GDP growth itself, which is the most macro indicator. Now, as many of the listeners would recall that we had contracted as an economy during the year when COVID happened. And as a result, there was a low base effect. And the next year we grew at 9%. But that was primarily because we had contracted the year before that. Last year, we grew at around 7%. And that was again seen as a residual effect of that low base. And 2023 was the year when it was expected that we'll get to a real understanding of how the economy is doing. And it is also interesting or noteworthy that our economy had been slowing down before COVID. So that much more importance was given to 2023. And the data on GDP growth shows that Indian economy has surprised everybody on the upside. The GDP has grown in a very robust manner. There have been some controversies around the GDP as usual, but if you just go by the numbers, then they have surprised on the upside. So that was one big takeaway, that the economy has grown at almost 6.5-7%, which was much higher than, or at least a percentage point higher than some of the lower estimates that people had. So that is on the GDP front.
And Udit, what do you think made that possible? Because our economy was really struggling. There were the after effects of COVID, and then there was the Russia-Ukraine war, which led to supply chain issues. So what turned things around in 2023?
So when you get down to the details of this, it is not terribly clear exactly what is triggering this. And I think a lot more data has to come through. As we also know, all the GDP data tends to get revised and, reclassified. So we'll wait for that. But on the face of it, it looks like that typically GDP grows because people consume more. Private sector firms, businesses, they invest into the economy by laying down new capacities. And government also spends a lot of money, invests in the economy. Those are the main triggers for economic growth. Now, it looks like that government's role in boosting GDP has been the main trigger. There are concerns still about private consumption, and there are concerns about private sector investment in the economy. How much they spend to boost the productive capacity. There are certain sectors where private sector is now coming forward and investing more, but there are many sectors in which it is not doing so. So as things stand from what the data we can see, it looks like that government has boosted the economy, played a big role in sort of giving us a surprise on the upside.
And you mentioned it briefly, but could you explain why is it a concern that the growth is more government-led? Why is it that we need a balance, or rather, why should that balance tilt in the favor of the private investors?
So typically, government's role in the economy should be counter-cyclical, which is to say that when the economy is doing well, the government should hold back. It doesn't need to actually take the lead. But when the economy is struggling, the government should actually take the lead. To that extent, what the government is doing is absolutely right, is taking a lead at a time when the economy is struggling or wants a sort of a trigger. But the reason is that government is a very small player in the overall economy. Although it's a very unique player, it's a small player. India's GDP, almost 55 to 60% of it is accounted by private consumption. The demand that you and I have as consumers, individual consumers. The second biggest trigger or engine of growth is the money spent by businesses towards investments, creating new productive capacity. That's the second biggest trigger. It's around 20% And government's role is only 10% in the overall GDP. So now why it's unsustainable is because you can't expect the smallest engine of growth to keep pulling the economy higher. The additional problem is also that governments also, even though they are unique in the sense that, unlike you and I, they don't have a strict budget constraint. They can borrow and print money and sort of get by, but there's a limit to that also. So you cannot even expect the government to just keep doing this year after year after year, because typically then the economies run into some kind of a trouble in terms of debt and government's ability to pay back its debts. So in the short term, it can do it, which private sector can't do, which as individuals we can't do. It can go beyond its means and trigger the economy into a better trajectory, but it can't do it endlessly. At some point, private sector has to play ball and our consumption levels have to improve.
Okay, so GDP was one area where we saw this very surprising growth. What other metrics did India fare well in?
So even the official employment numbers have been showing an uptick. Unemployment rate is down. Labor force participation rates are up. Another key metric is employment rate, or what we call worker population ratios. Those are up, which means that more people are now involved in the economy. More people are demanding more jobs. Unemployment rates are down. There are nuances to all these numbers, but if you look at just the macro numbers, then just like the GDP, labor-related ratios have also improved and continue to improve right through since the COVID pandemic, with each passing year.
Though as far as employment is concerned, and this is something you write about, one big asterisk there is who all we are counting as employed, right? Because according to official figures, even people who are self-employed are being counted as employed. And there's a big difference there because people who are self-employed are not getting regular salaries.
Yes. So when we talk about India's labor situation, one has to be a little careful for two reasons. One is the definitional issue on how you calculate jobs. What do you call a job? So if you look at say CMIE data, which is the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, that data shows a slightly different picture, a slightly more starker picture on unemployment or labor force participation rates. If you look at the formal data that we have through PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Surveys, the macro numbers might be improving. But if you drill down to the details, you'll find exactly what you're saying, that, there's a lot of self-employment that has increased. Now, the problem with self-employment and the kind of self-employment self-employment we are talking about is that this is the kind of self-employment that happens where women are joining family enterprises. Now, family enterprises sounds like a very fancy term, but what we are talking about is that there is so much economic distress in the economy that even the women in the household have to come and sell maybe vegetables or join some outlet where maybe somebody is doing some very small job. And the problem with such kind of self-employment is that the remuneration levels have remained stagnant right through the last 4-5 years. Actually, some data, even again from the PLFS, shows that real incomes have actually fallen. So if you see from the perspective of what inflation has done in the last 4-5 years, where everything has become 25-30% costlier over the last 4-5 years, real incomes falling is a terrible thing. And that is why more and more women are joining the labor force. So on the face of it, the number is improving, but it is out of distress.
Right. So it's a great thing that women are joining the workforce. But what you're saying is that right now they're joining because there seems to be massive distress because household incomes are going down and they're being compelled to join the labor force.
Yes, that is the big concern, that you could either call it the case that, our data is at a macro level improving, or you can sort of look at it for what it is, that the data is improving for the wrong reasons. And that has real, genuine policy concerns.
And so could you put these two things in context? Because at a time when we are seeing this rapid rise in GDP, we are not seeing private consumption going up that much. We're not seeing household incomes go up that much, and which also means that people have lesser savings. What does it mean for an economy when something like this happens?
So, again, this is something that we've discussed in the past, the phrase of a K-shaped recovery, an unequal recovery. So between you, me, there is a per capita income that is an average of our income. But suppose the richest man in India walks into this conversation, our per capita income will shoot up, right? But that doesn't mean that we are necessarily better off, right? So per capita incomes also tell you only so much. The argument was that some parts of India, some parts of Indian economy are doing very well, and that's papering over the distress in other parts of the economy. So this is how one can understand this thing. And the rise of self-employment, for example, somebody very interestingly put it that, there's a difference between an economy which is really growing in a desirable manner, because there the jobs are salaried jobs. Somebody pays you certain amount of money to come and employs you to come and do a job. In a struggling economy, people can take up self-employment out of distress because nobody is paying them a salary. So they have to do their own work. So rise in number of jobs, or that should not just be the only metric. You should also read why they are happening. And in this case, there are certain sections which are doing really well and many other sections which are not doing so well. And that is where the distress is showing up.
And Udit, what do experts say about what needs to happen in order for this to change? For average incomes to go up? Does it require more capital spending? Does it require more private investments, policy changes? What exactly needs to happen?
So, there are no easy answers to this, and there is no way anybody can overnight change the reality. And when we say a K-shaped recovery, it is also true that there is a certain amount of inequality which is sort of built into our growth model, the way we grow. This is not a system where everybody is given same salaries. And so there's a capitalist way of functioning in an economy that tends to be iniquitous in some senses. Now, the government's role typically is to plug those gaps, both through direct interventions, which is to give the poorest person some amount of either direct money or food to survive for the short term, or to invest in education and healthcare so that we become more productive over time. At one level, India has been trying to do that. Now, long-standing grouse that many of us have had is that does India and this is across party lines, does India invest enough on health and education, which is going to be the most fundamental investment in our most obvious resource, which is the human resources.
Yeah, and we always highlight that our health expenditure is sometimes below 1% of our GDP, and education is even less.
Exactly. Like one of the data that has just come around, been highlighted by former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan in his book, is that the latest subsidy that we've given to a microchip plant that is being envisaged comes to around crores of rupees, I think 3.2 crores per job. So for 500 jobs, creating 500 jobs. And the total amount of that subsidy is, around 1/3 of our education budget. So we have to also look at that, sometimes it can grab a lot of headlines that a project has done well and we are now maybe going to be preparing microchips. But India also has to ask how many of those plants are creating jobs for our people and what is the subsidy we are giving for it. And are we investing in a more broad-based educational program or, those concerns still remain.
Does it also tell us anything about our priorities? For example, the government can choose to give subsidies to an industry because it believes, well, that's our best way forward to generate employment. But we won't invest as much in education because we think the returns may not be immediate. Is that the reason?
Yes. So this is again an inbuilt sort of a problem within the economic model. Governments have 5-year tenures and they want to win elections. And typically there are more elections between those 5 years also. And we want to show results, whereas education and health improvements take maybe a much longer time period, maybe a decade or 15 years or 20 years. And there's always this toss-up for any government, whether to invest in the more long-term benefits, the fruits of which may not be visible in their own electoral cycle. And this is a thing that sort of every government everywhere in any democratic system has to deal with. And there has to be a consensus on the amount of money or the focus that countries have. I think traditionally, if you look back, a new budget is going to be delivered in a month's time. We spend barely 1 or 2% of our budgets on things like health and education. And that's been a glaring gap for a very long time. In the past, we always believed that lack of resources was an issue. But I think today we have more resources and one would imagine that, in the future, governments will spend a much bigger amount on health and education.
Udit, now let's talk about 2024. What do we assess are some of the biggest factors that will affect India's economy going forward and maybe continue this growth that we are seeing?
So if you want to answer this question, let's make an assumption for the moment that let's only focus on the macro numbers and not get into the nitty-gritty of, what's happening to specific, say, unemployment rate or why it's going down. On the whole, at the macro level, India's economy seems to be, as many people have said, almost poised for a takeoff, of a more long-term takeoff, in the sense that over the coming decade, 15 years, we seem to be poised for an improvement. GDP is likely to grow. It's not a matter of quibbling whether it'll grow at 6.5 or 7 or 8 or 9, but it'll grow much faster than the rest of the world. And that is why we'll be a center of attraction for the global capital. So on the whole, India seems to be poised. From that perspective, in my view, the only thing that sort of is a big problem for us is the price of oil. And associated to that is any geopolitical problem. So, conflicts like the Russia-Ukraine war or the Israel-Hamas war or anything new happening between US and China, say a conflict around Taiwan, something like that triggering a global supply chain problems or higher oil prices. Only those things can actually upset us. Otherwise, we seem poised for not just 2024 being a better year for growth, but also several more years of sustained economic development and growth.
Udit, this year, did we see a lot of fluctuation in oil prices for India because of geopolitical events?
No, I think thankfully we didn't see as much as one might have seen, because I think the Ukraine-Russia war has been, if one doesn't think that it's solved or coming close to closure, at least it's been priced in and it hasn't gone as bad as one might have feared. And even the Israel-Hamas conflict hasn't yet created the kind of ripple effect that it can possibly create. So in 2023, we didn't see the oil prices creating such a big drag. And that is the essential thing for an economy like India, which imports almost 80% of its oil requirement. Crude oil prices are a very key factor in how India grows. If those prices remain contained, and typically geopolitical problems trigger an increase there, if they remain contained, then I do not see any massive surprise beyond the very obvious, monsoon being normal and all of those holding back Indian economy from something like 6.5-7% kind of a growth rate.
Udit, the other major thing that will be happening this year are, of course, the Lok Sabha elections. This is a massive undertaking. To what extent do we see that affecting India's growth and even private sector sentiments?
So the first thing to understand is that, typically when governments change in any democracy, one has to look at the real effect is on policy changes. Now, unlike the West, where there are very specific policy differences, economic policy differences between the competing parties, in India, we tend to have a broader consensus on what is the economic policy. I don't think from one government to another, the policy choices change as much as maybe the implementation or timing or those issues could matter. But broadly, nobody disagrees with what India needs to do in terms of policy choices. So one thing to understand is that when in India elections happen, it's not so much from the policy perspective that everything changes. It is more a case of businesses being uncertain whether one particular sector may, get upstaged or by some other sector or, maybe some policy tweak somewhere changes the trajectory. But broadly, the story remains the same. The other additional thing is that in this particular case for 2024, it looks like that the incumbent government right now is likely to win the 2024 election. And that brings about a fair amount of clarity in the minds of the businessmen on how they want to progress. There is only a flip side on this, that under normal circumstances, if you expect the incumbent government to come back to power, the element of surprise could be higher if something deviates from that result. So that's the only thing. But, I don't think anybody really expects the incumbent government to lose out from another term. So while it is a big issue, national general elections in India is obviously an important thing. I don't think that given the possibility of return to power, it will actually make any difference.
And Udit, how different would things have been if BJP had not swept the Hindi heartland? For example, if Congress had won in these states, how do you think that would have changed our conversations about the economy?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is exactly the point that, if Congress had won, then there would have been a much greater chance that people would have thought that maybe 2024 general elections might see a surprising result, in the sense that, maybe opposition does much better, or maybe the BJP's, say, grip on the Lok Sabha, where most of the laws are sort of initiated and made, might loosen. And that would have sort of made many businesses, imagine a company or a businessman who's running based on the production-linked incentive scheme that the current government is running. Or you're about to start something that is based on that assumption that PLI scheme will be there. They may just hold back because if they're not sure. If Congress had won, then that clarity obviously would not have been there, as we see now, given that Congress has not won. Also, the fact that the Congress party has been, or at least their leadership has been, fairly critical of one or two big private sector businesses. And so that just creates an environment or doubt in the minds of many other businesses whether India is likely to go into a very different policy environment if there was a change of a government at the center.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.